What if I told you America's biggest trade threat isn't China, it's Canada? Canada just hijacked America's supply chain, and no one saw it coming. While Trump shouts about China, Ottawa locked down the minerals, built the factories, and signed the deals that now control U.S. electric vehicles, military tech, and green energy. A $13 billion move that makes U.S. automakers dependent on its minerals. European firms are rerouting supply chains through Montreal. The Inflation Reduction Act, Canada flipped. It turned it into a funding stream for its own battery empire. And here's the part no one in Washington wants to admit: America can't go electric build or fight without Canada's permission. So the real question is what happens when Canada says no? In the same month, Trump revived tariff threats against EV imports. Bloomberg reports Volkswagen finalized the first phase of its $13 billion battery plant in Ontario, one that qualifies for U.S. tax credits under the Inflation Reduction Act despite being built in Canada. According to Canadian officials, over 70% of U.S. EV supply chains now rely on Canadian-sourced components or mineral processing. While Washington stages high-stakes trade summits, Ottawa secures upstream control. From raw extraction to final assembly, without provoking political blowback or inciting protectionist headlines. The Wall Street Journal noted in April that U.S. auto firms are rerouting imports through Canadian factories to sidestep Trump-era tariffs, effectively outsourcing compliance to a neighbor he's publicly antagonized. If America's Buy American policies are built on Canadian batteries, minerals, and parts, who's really calling the shots? But that's just the front end. Because what Canada built behind closed doors is even more strategic and even harder to unwind. The U.S. Department of Energy estimates that demand for critical minerals will grow fivefold by 2030. Yet, according to the Canadian press, over 90% of nickel, cobalt, and graphite destined for North American EVs will be processed in Canada by 2027. Ontario's Ring of Fire region alone holds enough high-grade chromite and nickel to supply Tesla and Ford for the next 2 decades, according to mining expert Jack Lifton. Yet Trump's administration recently launched an executive probe into foreign mineral imports, including from Canada, while continuing to fund some of the very refineries through the Defense Production Act. It's a contradiction not lost on observers. The U.S. is subsidizing the leverage it's about to retaliate against, Lifton told Reuters in May. Meanwhile, China's dominance over rare earths has pushed EU and U.S. buyers to prioritize Canadian sources, further entrenching Ottawa as a mineral gatekeeper. And that's before we look at how this strategy cascades through battery supply chains and geopolitical alliances alike. Canada's industry ministry confirmed in April that more than $34 billion in EV battery-related investment has been secured since 2021, with Volkswagen, Stellantis, and LG Energy all choosing Ontario and Quebec as their North American hubs. According to the Financial Post, BASF's $1.2 billion cathode materials plant in Baikonur will feed over 400,000 EVs annually. By 2026, vehicles built and sold in the U.S., but powered by Canadian chemistry. The reason? As S&P Global noted, Canada's ability to streamline permitting secure Indigenous partnerships and leverage trade access to both Europe and the U.S. creates a cost and time advantage Washington can't replicate. Ironically, the Inflation Reduction Act, intended to bolster U.S. battery independence, is now helping fund Canadian supply dominance. The IRA's fine print became Canada's strategic blueprint, said energy analyst Leah Stokes in a March interview with Bloomberg Green. But even the most carefully designed battery empire isn't immune to policy whiplash, and the cracks are starting to show. Honda's announcement in May that it would pause its $15 billion Canadian EV expansion sent shockwaves through Ottawa's industrial plans. As reported by CTV News, the decision stems from U.S. tariff threats and Canada's rollback of consumer EV rebates, with sales falling 12% year over year, according to data from Statistics Canada. Ivy Business School's Gal Raz warned that without provincial and federal incentive alignment, flagship projects will become liabilities instead of launchpads. Meanwhile, Stellantis' Next Star plan in Windsor is proceeding, but executives have reportedly asked for renegotiation clauses if the U.S. market continues to destabilize. With Quebec slashing its subsidies and Ontario yet to reintroduce any, Bloomberg Intelligence now projects a 26% reduction in new EV investment commitments across Canada for the second half of 2025. But the bigger question isn't about rebates or factories. It's about leverage and how fast it can disappear when the political winds shift. Trump's revived rhetoric around economic annexation of Canada may have started as a provocation, but his administration's policy moves suggest something deeper. In April, he signed an executive order to initiate a critical mineral dependency review, citing national security risks tied to foreign sources. But analysts like Elizabeth Stein from the University of Calgary say it's less about security and more about creating bargaining chips. This is pressure designed to coerce, not confront, she told the Canadian press. Ontario's new legislation to fast-track mining in the Ring of Fire region, designating it a special economic zone, reflects that urgency. Yet Indigenous leaders have issued formal opposition warning that bypassing treaty rights could spark legal battles and protests. You cannot override sovereignty with a tariff schedule, said MPP Saul Mamakwa. Meanwhile, the U.S. imports over 80% of its gallium, niobium, and palladium from either Canada or war-torn nations like the DRC and Ukraine, according to the U.S. Geological Survey. Trump may seek to weaken Canada's position, but any misstep could ignite resistance both at home and abroad. And if that happens, the trade war won't be a matter of economics. It'll be a political powder keg waiting for a spark. In 2025, while U.S. trade policy toward Asia was defined by steel tariffs and semiconductor controls, Canada funneled $2.3 billion into infrastructure logistics hubs and bilateral deals across Indonesia, Vietnam, and India, according to Global Affairs Canada. These aren't symbolic MOUs. They're logistics corridors and processing partnerships explicitly aimed at decoupling supply routes from Chinese bottlenecks and bypassing U.S. control. Bloomberg reported in March that Canada's Indo-Pacific Business Council signed over a dozen pre-commercial agreements targeting rare earth mineral exchanges and grid tech deployment, giving Ottawa early-stage control over commodity lanes the U.S. once dominated. Unlike Washington's security-first diplomacy, Canada's model is built on co-investment and contract reciprocity. But if the U.S. remains focused on military containment and Canada keeps delivering trade solutions, who becomes the indispensable partner in Asia? Because while Washington pushes power, Ottawa's selling reliability. And that has a very different kind of gravity. Following Trump's threat of a 20% auto tariff on EU-assembled vehicles, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney met with both Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron to accelerate critical minerals access for Europe via Canada, sidestepping U.S. ports and political uncertainty. According to the European Commission, bilateral trade with Canada has grown 65% since 2017 under CETA. But in Q1 2025 alone, EU investment in Canadian EV supply chains surged 41% year over year as firms hedge against both Russian instability and American unpredictability. Canada's Trade Minister, Mary Ung, told Reuters that cobalt and nickel partnerships with the EU now cover more than 60% of joint material sourcing needs, with additional processing sites being co-financed in Quebec and Sudbury. While Washington's trade bandwidth is consumed by China and domestic election cycles, Ottawa is positioning itself as Europe's mineral vault. And if it succeeds, Brussels may shift more of its transatlantic strategy to Montreal instead of D.C. But there's a catch because deepening with Europe could come at the expense of another strategic front Ottawa's already struggling to maintain. According to S&P Global and IRS compliance filings reviewed by the Financial Post, at least 17 U.S.-based manufacturers have restructured their procurement pipelines through Canadian intermediaries to qualify for Inflation Reduction Act credits, using Canadian process components to meet domestic sourcing thresholds. This legal workaround, leveraging USMCA free movement while avoiding penalties tied to Chinese content, now funnels billions in tax-advantaged products back into U.S. markets through facilities in Ontario, Manitoba, and Quebec. For firms like GM and Ford, this bypass isn't just strategic, it's existential. Bloomberg Intelligence reported in May that EVs assembled with Canadian cathodes can avoid up to 15% in retaliatory duties, shaving thousands off unit costs. Yet this growing dependence could backfire. If Trump redefines foreign entity of concern to include Canada under a revised trade executive order, as hinted in recent speeches, these firms may find themselves locked out of the very benefits they re-engineered to secure. So what happens when your best loophole becomes your next liability? While Washington clings to bilateral dominance and reactive tariffs, Canada has constructed a multi-regional lattice of trade agreements and material access that no single power can easily disrupt. As of Q2 2025, Canada maintains active trade treaties covering over 65% of global GDP, compared to 45% for the United States, according to World Bank data. This isn't just about scale, it's about flexibility. Canadian exports of rare earths to Asia rose 34% in the last 12 months, while shipments to the EU outpaced U.S. counterparts for the first time in Q1, per Statistics Canada. Instead of waging trade wars, Ottawa built bridges from Europe's Green Deal to Southeast Asia's manufacturing revival, backed by supply chain credibility and regulatory stability. Yet the U.S. still assumes Canada will follow its lead, a hypothesis increasingly challenged by Trudeau's Ouster-Carney's pivot and a trade architecture more aligned with Berlin and Tokyo than Washington. But if Canada's web holds and America's walls crack, who really writes the new rules of global trade? This story doesn't end with tariffs or treaties. It ends with leverage. Canada isn't competing to replace the U.S. It's positioning itself to make the question irrelevant. While Washington doubles down on exclusion, Ottawa is quietly building a system of inclusion. Open ports, flexible alliances, and mineral corridors stitched across 3 continents. And yet the most uncomfortable question for Trump's trade team remains unanswered. If America needs Canadian minerals to function, but punishes the hand that supplies them, what happens when that hand stops reaching? So before you click away, think about this. Canada's strategy doesn't explode. It expands, quietly, systematically. And by the time anyone notices it's working, they're already too late. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.